So for this year's thing, we got to go back. I'm going to do two people that we could not find any family or any relatives or anything, but that does not lessen their contributions, and they should be in the Hall of Fame. And the first one we're going to go in the middle section from 20 to 40 was a gentleman named John W. Burgess, who was raised on the North Shore of Boston, had a talent for becoming an artist. He got on a scholarship to some big fancy school in Boston, and he just didn't like the constraints about it, and he went out and continued on his own. But his older brother ran sprint cars, and he got into sprint cars too, and midgets, etc. And in the mid-30s, the midgets came to New England, and he was interested in promoting them, and he and two of his cohorts made a run of 15 dozen midgets or so, and they rented them, leased them out, and they had the first race for midgets in northern New England. There was a little bit in southwestern Connecticut, being so close to New York City, which was already going. But they ran a race at a place called Lincoln Park in Boston, and it was successful. And the promoter, already acting in promoter ways sometimes, he said, "Yeah, you guys are good. You want to come back next week?" And they said, "Sure." He said, "Well, a couple of things. You got to hire my cousin Louie to be the parking attendant. You got to hire my aunt Genovese to cook and everything, you know, and you got to hire this cop and that cop." And they said, "Forget it." And they said, "Where you going to go?" So they went up to Topsfield, Mass, and outside the fairgrounds there, they ran a little 5th-mile dirt oval, and that continued till after the war. So that was the impetus for midget racing coming to New England. He, during the war, worked for GE in the development of some hush-hush stuff out in the Muroc Dry Lakes, and continued his artwork. He did a lot of paintings of these rockets and crazy planes, and became a well-known artist. And around the 80s or so, he started publishing sketches of his old sprint car days. He did calendars. They've been in famous books and prints, and they were well-known everywhere. He met Briggs Cunningham, a Hall of Fame member, at the New York World's Fair in 1940. And he had rebuilt a car on consignment from Briggs, one of high-dollar racing cars. And they met up face-to-face at that time. And when Mr. Cunningham got his big museum going in California, he hired John to be a curator, a position he held until he, unfortunately, for a man with an artistic bent, both mechanically and art-wise, he started to lose his sight. And John died in 2007. Nope, wait a minute, I'm looking at the wrong bio. 92. So that was, I always thought he was kind of like the father of midget racing in New England. The second gentleman is from Connecticut, Fred Meeker, from Norwalk in the western part of the state. He had a relatively brief career in the midgets. He won the first ever, most notable probably, NEMA race in 1953 at the Seekonk, Mass Speedway. He went on to become the NASCAR midget champion 2 consecutive years, 55 and 56. And then he ended up third the following year. He ran mostly the Fred Kiernan V860, which more than held its own against the predominantly Orphees in the ARDC. And he died himself in 2007, as I previously mentioned. Now finally, we're going to bring up people saying, "Who are these guys?" Somebody looked at the cover of the program sitting next to me and said, "Who the heck are these guys with the big top hats and the lots of hair on the face?" And they were Francis Edgar Stanley and Freeland Oscar Stanley. And many of the older people are genuine car nuts in here heard of the Stanley steamers. Well, these were the gentlemen that developed the Stanley steamer. And they grew up in Kingfield, Maine, which I looked on the map, and man, there's nothing out there but just a few little dots of cities here and there. But they were pretty much self-taught guys. They were very talented. They made their own violins that worked quite well. They invented the airbrush, which many people in here have had to deal with in their businesses. They invented the dry printing plate thing, which was so successful and more economical than anything else on the market for that. Kodak pursued them relentlessly for years. Eventually they succumbed to the lure of money and sold it to them. But I remember most, and most people do, for developing the Stanley steamer automobile. In the early days, back around the turn of the century, there were 3 motive powers: steam, gas, and electricity. and they were about the best steam car going. They were successful on the oval tracks, very successful on hill climbs throughout New England, and the most famous thing was the high-speed runs. And they set a record on Ormond Beach in Florida in 1906. And when I was talking to people about this, I said, how fast do you think a car would go in 1906? And I had everything from 20 miles an hour to maybe 60, most people said. I said, well, yeah. Well, the boys from Maine did it at 127.66 in 1906. And they just looked at me like I was full of crap. But it's true. Unfortunately, they built a larger one the following year, and the same driver, Fred Marriott, who worked for the company, was a single man, so he ended up with the driving chores, and he was approaching 200 at Ormond Beach. Almost too high to record how fast he was going. There was a little dip at the beach, and he took quite a vicious flip, and they all retired from racing right after that. So at this point, I'd like to invite up, all the way here from New Jersey, Sarah Stanley and her husband, Don Davidson, who was a relative, distant relative of one of the Stanley brothers, and John Lindeman, who is from nearby Glastonbury, Connecticut, and is the head of the board of directors of the Stanley Museum in Kingfield, Maine. So if you'd please come on up, we'll get you your plaque.
Hi, my name is John Linderman. I'm one of the trustees of the Stanley Museum, and I'd like to thank the New England Antique Racing Association for honoring the Stanley brothers that came up with the Stanley steamer. When I first heard about this, my first reaction is, how did you ever find out about us? First of all, it was 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, when the Stanleys were doing the racing. As Mr. Sylvia just mentioned, it was 1906 when they first broke the record down in Ormond Beach. And beside that being so long ago, it was a steam car that did this. And there's not that big a community even today in the steam car. So I talked to Mr. Massey, and he advised me that it was really Mr. Sylvia, who was, I guess, your historian. And so I'd like to give a special thanks to Mr. Sylvia.
Thank you. For
recognizing the Stanley family and the racing exploits that they did. When I heard about the award, I thought, well, really, this is for the Stanley twins. They were twins that really did the development of the steam cars and the racers back then. And I thought it would really be appropriate if we could get a relative. And so coming here today to accept the award is the great-granddaughter of F.O. Stanley, Sarah Stanley.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me all right? It's a pleasure to be here. This is a new organization, as John was just saying, for us to hear about. We're thrilled to know about this wonderful organization. It's been a pleasure to meet you, Ari, for the first time, and Mr. Massey. Thank you so much for having us here. Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Stanley. I'm the great-granddaughter of Francis Edgar Stanley and the great-grandniece of Freeland Oscar Stanley. On behalf of my great-grandfather and his identical twin, I thank you for this recognition of their contribution to auto racing. It's an honor to receive this induction into the New England Auto Racing Hall of Fame on their behalf and as a representative of the Stanley family. I look forward to giving this award to the Stanley Museum in Kingfield, Maine, the twins' birthplace, and an organization established in 1981 to remember and share the important history and contribution of the twins and their family. In the early days of the car industry and racing, steam set the performance pace. On January 26, 1906, the Stanley Racer, driven by Fred Marriott, set an astounding speed record, as you mentioned a minute ago, Ari, on the dense sands of Ormond Beach, reaching over 127 miles per hour. The record was unbeaten for 4 years, the longest time such a record has held so long. These two men were technologists, car people, They had insatiable appetites for knowledge and technology, an unstoppable energy and vision forward into and through unsolved technical questions and challenges. They were fiercely independent. They had great humor, tremendous wit, a deep love of music and art. My sense as I conjure from these 3 generations past is the magnitude of their technological vision and prowess was matched with a vitality and passion for life. True representatives of Yankee ingenuity. It's important to remember our automotive history and our racing history. Thank you for helping us do so with this tremendous honor.